Okay, this is going to be my most mathy video that I've done in a while. Recently, I did a video talking about whether you should allow different potentially problematic kinds of people onto your project. In that video, I said every single person you add to your project has a cost beyond simply their salary. So let's talk about that. Why is there a cost for every single person that you add? The simple answer is because of communication channels. So let's talk about how we can figure out how many different communication channels that there are. So let's see if we can build that formula. We might start out by thinking, well, maybe it's just equal to the number of people on the project. But no, that's not quite right, because if there's just one person on the project, there isn't one communication channel, there's zero. So, okay, let's multiply the number of people by one less than the number of people. So maybe that works. That gives us zero communication channels if there is a single person. We move that up to two people, we get two communication channels. That's not right either, because there aren't two communication channels. I talk to you and you talk to me. That's a single channel, not two channels. So let's divide that by two. That gets us something. That gets us the number of channels of one. So let's go one further. If we go up to three different people, does it make sense that we would have three different communication channels? Well, there's me and you and me and the other guy. So that's two, and then you two. So that's three channels. So yeah, it does seem like we are left with this formula. The number of communication channels is equal to the number of people times one less than the number of people divided by two. But we don't really care about the number of communication channels, do we? What we care about is the amount of time that this is taking up in the organization. So let's multiply that number of communication channels by the amount of time it takes a person to engage with that communication channel. So we get this formula where the total communication time in an organization is equal to the number of people times the number of people minus one divided by two times the amount of time that is used up in each people channel. One reason sometimes very small pods, very small teams are reluctant to add new people is they might be spending a lot of time on each of their communication channels. If you have a team of just two people, they might be spending an hour a day interacting with each other. Maybe you even want that. It can be adequately efficient for that tiny team. But if you then increase that team size from 2 to 5, you've gone from one communication channel to 10 communication channels. If each of those channels is costing an hour, well, that's going to completely disable the team. They're going to be just completely consumed by the communication channels. So very small teams can develop very deep, very high throughput communication that is more than they probably need. And then when they look at the possibility of adding more people into that mix, they can't imagine continuing that communication. And the reality is they can't. Their communication is going to have to change in some way if that's the way they are currently communicating amongst themselves. Now, you might be sensing that there's something wrong with this. And yeah, there kind of is, because this scales in this n squared way. If you imagine an organization of 7,200 people, and there are organizations significantly larger than 7,200 people, if each communication channel is only taking 1 second per day, then that is 7,199 hours spent on all of these communication channels every single day. That's almost an hour per person dealing with the 7,200 people on the project. And that obviously isn't true. If you've ever been in a large organization, there must be more going on, because you're spending significantly more time with some of your communication channels, and you're spending effectively zero time on most of these communication channels. So what's actually going on? Why does this formula, which shows the number of communication channels, break down so quickly as we get to larger teams? Well, the reality is that it's more complicated than that. So what happens is we take an organization beyond a certain size and we break it up into different pods. So within a studio, I might still have that original communication time where I have a certain amount of communication with every single person within the team. Maybe it's just 10 minutes a year at the Christmas party, but there's still some amount of time I spend communicating with all of the people within the studio. But within that, I'm inside of a pod. So within the pod, the team is much smaller. And I am going to spend time communicating with those people within the pod of 9 or 10 people much more. So how does this break down? Well, within a team, within a project, what you have is a bunch of different levels of communication. With all of the members of the team, I might be spending a small amount of time communicating with those communication channels. Maybe we have team building meetings. Maybe there are situations under which I'm interacting with them. If we are in a physical studio, I'm bumping into them in the hallway. We're talking about something on the project on a relatively infrequent basis. So my time per channel for the members of the team is actually quite small. And then I'm inside of a smaller sub-team within that overall game team. That team is going to be much smaller, hopefully 10 or less people. I am interacting with the members of that team a lot more. My cost for those communication channels might be incredibly large. It might be 20 minutes a day. It might be half an hour a day. It can be quite significant. And then, because now the overall game team consists of several of these pods, we need these pods to communicate with each other. So we end up doing a similar formula of the number of pods to figure out the cost of the amount of communication channel between pods. The time I'm spending with the people on my pod, much higher than the time I'm spending with the people outside of the pod. The amount of communication time required to talk between pods, much higher than the amount of time between individual people. But you might have specialized people whose entire job it is to handle and facilitate this communication. Depending on how these pods are structured, you might end up in a situation where that cost to communicate between pods is so high that the entire structure is not functioning. If your pods are self-contained, then you need to communicate where the pods meet, where one mission meets another mission. A very common place where projects run into trouble is in the interstitial between missions. But if you structure your teams wrong, where you have the people who are building the level design and the people who are building the level art in different pods, then the communication between the pods is going to be so onerous that it's going to be almost unmanageable. So how do you create a good pod? The most important thing is you want it to be as independent as possible. So the answer to what a good pod looks like is actually pretty dependent on where you are in the project development cycle. Really early on, when you are figuring out norms, when you are figuring out processes, when you are figuring out what good looks like, it might make a lot of sense for each pod to be very discipline focused. If you put all the writers together, they're figuring out what the tone is going to feel like, and they're doing experiments and bouncing ideas off of each other to try to figure out what the writing is going to feel like. The level artists are setting down rules around what the tile set should look like, what the architectural rules are, what the standards for how wide a hallway is going to be. But as you move further into the project, as you get into different stages of production, it's going to make more and more sense for these groups, these pods, to become interdisciplinary, because it makes less sense to have all the level artists in one single pod when you are starting to build actual levels, actual missions, because at that point, it makes a lot more sense to put the level artist with the level designer who's working on the same mission, with the combat designer who's working on the encounters for that mission. It starts to make more sense to build these pods that, again, are independent, are capable of doing as much as possible on their own. But at this stage in the project, it becomes necessary to have more than one discipline. So don't be afraid to change what your pods look like as you go through the process of the project. At the start, maybe you build it entirely discipline by discipline. Maybe you put all the level artists together, all the writers together, all the level designers together, and they work out norms. But then, as you start to build actual content that is going to be touched by a player, you are going to want to move to something more interdisciplinary. But make sure, if that's your plan, that everyone knows that this is the plan, because people get used to being surrounded by certain people. So if you have all the writers together all the time, and then suddenly you want to break them apart and scatter the writers into each of the mission pods, while that can be an excellent idea and can lead to better pod construction, a better ability to have pods that are independent of each other, the writers are legitimately going to be resistant to that because they're used to hanging out and interacting with a certain group of people, and you're changing the rules on them. So make sure, if that's the idea, if that's the plan, that everyone knows going in that chances are that the groups are going to shift around. Maybe even show them in what ways they're going to shift. It's worth quickly saying that it isn't necessary for you to break apart these discipline pods when you create these more feature-focused, player-focused pods that are going to carry you through to the end of the project. But it's still important that people understand where the primacy lies. In the early stages of the project, chances are that primacy is going to live with the craft. So writing is going to be most focused on what other writers have to think. Whereas as you get more into production, deeper and deeper into the project, you want that primacy to live with the actual content that is going to be touched by the player. So you don't have to force the writers to stop talking to each other, but just make sure that everyone knows that you are going to drive the project through these feature-driven pods, if you can pull that off. If at all possible, you're going to want to divide your content up along similar lines. While it can be tempting to think that having a level artist own levels A, B, and C, and then 3 different level designers own those same missions to cause some intermixing, that is going to increase the amount of communication that's required. Better to make that one pod own the same missions as much as possible. Again, the goal here is to limit the cross communication as much as possible. Allow norms to form. Allow the team to come together and figure out how to talk within itself as efficiently as possible. You can move things around when you need to, but don't introduce unnecessary cross connections, because all you're doing is complicating the communication structure. Moving from a flat, everyone is interacting with everyone to some degree, to something more structured is very expensive, because now you are introducing different levels of communication, different levels of interaction. But beyond a relatively small size, this additional level of abstraction of communication becomes necessary, because it doesn't take that many people before managing the communication between the other members of the team becomes an all-consuming time commitment from your employees. So finding a structure that can work as you scale beyond your current size is critically important to doing that. And one of the reasons why you might say that adding people isn't worth it is because you don't want to change the structure you are currently operating under. As we move beyond projects, we're able to eliminate the person-to-person communication almost completely. If you've worked at a very large studio, chances are there are people within that organization, a large percentage of the people within that organization, the majority of the people within that organization, who you have never interacted even once. So what you end up doing when you're figuring out your total communication time for your organization is you treat each studio or each organization where communication between organizations is minimal or zero, as if they are independent groups. And then you layer on a inter-studio communication, which again uses that same n times n minus 1 over 2 channel cost. Depending on how you are organizing yourselves, the cost of talking between studios might be relatively small if studios are treated as virtually independent. But if you're trying to move people between studios, between projects from time to time, that cost might be relatively high. But again, in this case, your number of studios relatively small, so you might be able to bear a very high cost of intra-studio communication in order to allow those studios to remain relatively independent. I recognize this is very mathy, but it's worth thinking about how much it's costing us to add people to our projects and how beyond certain thresholds, the communication time required by our individual employees can become quite burdensome. And it may be necessary for us to adopt more sophisticated communication structures, more sophisticated structure in order to allow them to spend their time doing what we want them to be doing, which is making a game. It's not to say we don't want them communicating with other team members. In fact, it's vitally important that they communicate with the people that are helping with the areas of game that they are working on. But this is why pods can be so powerful, because the people they are interacting with on a day-to-day basis are working towards the same player-facing goals. Everyone that they're talking to day-to-day is working on the same mission, and they all work together towards that same goal. They can build their own shorthands. They can find their own ways to communicate that allows them to move with agility and to make the best thing that they can make and not have to deal with the other 50, 60, 70, 200, 400, 500 people that may be on the project around them. They are able to concentrate their efforts on their team and on working and solving their problems. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you are interested in becoming a member, there will be a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you are more comfortable with that. Additionally, we have merch now. This is the File It All and Let Triage Sort It Out if you are interested in supporting the channel in that way. What are some teams you've worked on that had excellent structure, that had ways of facilitating communication that really made things smooth? I have worked on very small teams which functioned incredibly smoothly with basically no structure. But below a certain point, the number of channels is so small that you don't need a structure. Have you worked on a team where the structure was really great, but the team was also really big? Let's talk about that down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.